This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. We come to you daily with short business episodes, short private equity episodes, interviews with brilliant people. And I've got one on today. We're talking today with David Pivnick. And David is a partner at McGuireWoods. He's valedictorian of his law school class. He's one of the smartest people I get to ever visit with. We try generally to talk about a serious subject and then also talk about something that's more entertaining or more interesting to us. I'll start with a serious subject, David, and then we're going to talk about leadership and changes in leadership. And are the Bears on the way back now that they've changed their play calling? They sure looked a lot better this week. They may be forever cursed. Before we get to that, let's talk about the FTC, the DOJ, Lena Khan, and what's going to happen under Trump administration with Antitrust and the Department of Justice, quite frankly. Lena Khan, FTC commissioner, leader of the FTC, has led the most aggressive FTC, I think, in decades right now, and a lot good, a lot bad. Many of us thought there was a need for more antitrust enforcement. It feels to me almost like the dog who caught the car. You wanted more antitrust enforcement, and then you got to sort of like, oh my God, we're in for an adventure now because it's not been a fine line. It's been every place. Some of it we think misguided, some of it we think rightfully guided. What's going to happen now that she is, essentially fired and we move on to an FTC? Is antitrust enforcement going to dry up? Or are we going to still see antitrust enforcement? And what else are you expecting now that, and I don't mean to make a joke of it, but Dr. Oz is now going to be in charge of Medicare or CMS. He does seem like a huckster and a big privatization person when Medicare privatization has been a disaster so far. And I'm not an anti-Trump person at all. I'm a big fan of his Elise Stefanik pick. I'm not against his Marco Rubio pick. I'm totally fine with Mike Huckabee, a variety of his picks so far. But some of these seem goofy, at least the Mehmet Oz one. But FTC, Mehmet Oz, any thoughts so far?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. And first of all, I appreciate you clarifying at the end that you weren't a big fan of Dr. Oz's selection, because when you had referred to him as a huckster, I think it was subtle, and some of the listeners may not have appreciated your full perspective. So the clarification was very useful there. But I will say generally on the FTC front first, I think there's clearly going to be a reduced enforcement environment relative to where we're at right now. I think incoming President Trump's platform has been pretty clear on scaling back government and regulations, and whatever may play out with the Department of Governmental Efficiency and its co-heads. I think that's clearly a priority, and being pro-business and pushing smaller government is clearly going to be high on the agenda. So I think we will see a certainly less robust enforcement environment from the FTC. I don't know at this point, sort of A, how much will be scaled back, and B, how quickly it will be scaled back relative to some of the efforts and initiatives that are already underway. But I think it goes without saying it'll be a smaller, a less robust enforcement agenda that will be pursued by the FTC. At least I think that is reasonably anticipated based on the incoming president. And I think, one of the things that has been interesting about many of the picks for his cabinet, and I agree with you that my mileage and perspective on many of them varies pretty greatly from nominee to nominee. I share some level of concern with Dr. Oz and his qualifications for that particular role. I also, putting aside personal concerns or issues regarding his past, I do find Matt Gaetz as Attorney General to be an interesting nomination, primarily just because it's a pretty significant law enforcement position in this country. And I know I'm grossly understating it in describing it that way. And he obviously has an incredibly limited, set of experience as a practicing attorney. That's just not what he's done. And so, from the political side of that role, which is not necessarily the intended function of the AG. I think he may have some qualities that are well suited, and he's certainly navigated DC for many years. But from the actual law enforcement side, I think it will be interesting. And again, I suspect scaling back some of the investigations and the areas of focus will be part of the agenda on that front. I think it's just too early to say, how much will be scaled back and whether that's focused on, investigations that are deemed quote unquote political versus enforcement more generally. And one of the things I know you and I have both quipped about in past discussions, both I think on this podcast and otherwise, is there's not really a pro-fraud lobby. So on things like False Claims Act enforcement, which is where I spend a lot of my time and effort, I don't know that it will be that big a scaling back or a reduction in enforcement efforts, primarily because it's not like either political party has a particular priority on allowing fraud or walking back that enforcement.
Let me ask you a question there. I mean, does Tesla, SpaceX, and X now have a get-out-of-jail-free card given Elon's support for the president? And does that only last as long as he stays in the good graces of the president?
I think it's probably a bridge too far to describe it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Do I think it raises some serious questions about how things could be pursued and also perceived when issues come up? Yeah, I think it certainly gives rise to questions. And I think it's not just from an enforcement perspective. I mean, Elon is now going to be playing a meaningful role in the government, not just from his close personal connection with President Trump, but through his role with the newly minted Department of Governmental Efficiency, and he has significant ties to companies with government contracts. So there are some conflict issues that I am cautiously optimistic will be thought about and worked through. But I certainly, I don't view it as a get-out-of-jail-free card, but I think it is clearly beneficial for anyone to have, ties of that nature. And I think Elon is certainly no exception and is deliberate in his approach. But I also think your last point is well taken, that obviously, as we saw during the first Trump presidency, there were certainly changes in his cabinet on what felt to me at the time like a fairly quick pace and more than I recall for other presidencies. So if we see the kind of same turnover in this upcoming 4 years as we saw in the initial 4, yeah, it certainly remains to be seen how long Elon will remain in the good graces and how things will ultimately land up for him.
Right. I mean, that's a fascinating discussion, quite frankly, because who knows, quite frankly, right, if he'll stay in great graces with the president or not. It seems to be a hard thing to do, although some have done it, not Nikki Haley or Mike Pompeo, but others have. Or Mike Pence, I think, seems to be out of favor as well. But Marco Rubio's come back into favor. Maybe Jeb Bush will, but it is fascinating to watch. It really is. Let's go to a different subject that's near and dear to my heart. A few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, I said, well, it sure looks like the Bears are back into dynasty territory. They have turned the corner. At the time, they were 4-2. Their offense was ticking on all cylinders, and it looked like greatness was coming again. You, at that point, laughed at my comment, which was so rude. It turns out that you may have been more correct.
I believe I called you cute at the time, if I recall correctly.
Well, and again, it's coming from a middle-aged, balding person, I sort of will let that go. I don't take it. I don't think that's cute nor funny, and I don't think it shocks me. There is no person that we have regularly on our podcast that more outkicked their coverage in marriage than my colleague David Pivnick, who married a wonderful, wonderful woman who's beautiful, and David is like me as a face for radio. So let's go back to the topic at hand, David. You would correct, and that's intended as a positive shout out to Haley, not as a knock on your looks and attractiveness at all. Let's go back.
It can be both, and it's accurate. I take no offense to that.
Well, let's go back then to the concept at hand. Can turnarounds happen? Can the change of an executive make a huge difference? In this case, the Bears, of course, lost 3 in a row. They lost their 11th in a row to the Green Bay Packers. They look much better this week, but just, of course, they can't beat the Packers for anything. Aaron Rodgers, famous political commentator, once said that he owns the Bears, but it seems like just Green Bay owns the Bears. But it seems like the offense clicked a lot better this week. And one of the key things was Caleb Williams getting rid of the ball in 2 seconds versus 2.9 seconds or 3 seconds. Was that just a lesson he had to hear? 2 seconds, you make a decision. What happened exactly that made it move in the right direction?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is it was a very, very small sample size. And I think that it's wonderful that Bears fans are, currently pulling all sorts of muscles, stretching to get to the silver lining on a loss at home to your biggest rival, on a missed makeable field goal at the end because you got blocked. Like, it was about as awful and gut punch of a loss as a team could possibly have, and only Bears fans could come away with it from it saying, oh yeah, this is great. But I think, look, they need a change in leadership. The offensive coordinator, I think the guy they brought in, I actually think could be a decent fit long term, and I hope he gets the audition for the rest of this year and may stick around. I think they clearly need a change in head coach as well. It is not a team that comes prepared with a good game plan every single week. They're outclassed from a preparedness standpoint and a game plan standpoint every week. But I don't think beyond that I would draw bigger takeaways from last week's game. Caleb Williams looked much better than he'd looked the prior couple weeks. I still think Caleb Williams can be just fine. I'm not sure that the comparisons to Patrick Mahomes that were being made 6 months ago are ever going to ring true, but I think he can certainly have a solid career. But overall, the offense was not able to finish drives and get in the end zone consistently, and the game was close in large part because Jordan Love really enjoys throwing the ball to the other team. And so if he figures that out, the Packers will stay way ahead of the Bears. But I think, I know we're taking next week off for Thanksgiving. I think you guys have a decent chance against Minnesota this weekend at home. And I think if we had done this next Wednesday, you'd have been feeling very, very good until Thursday, where the Lions are going to absolutely obliterate the Bears. And then when we talk again in a couple weeks, I suspect you'll be a little bit down. But the long-term answer is I think there's a lot of good pieces in place. I think the Bears are building the team the right way. I think Ryan Poles overall is doing a pretty darn good job. And I think they need to continue to build the offensive line and bring in a head coach with better ideas and a better control of the roster. And I think if they do that, the future actually could be bright, and I won't have to just call Bears fans cute in the future.
Thank you very, very much. Your favorite team is the Dallas Cowboys.
Yep.
It would be nice to hear you give a little critique of that franchise because it seems to be awful as well.
So, yeah, first of all, there's not enough bad things that could be said about the current state of the Cowboys. The one thing that I've learned this season, which actually makes cheering for just an awful football team much more tolerable, is sports betting in Illinois is now legal, and you can extend lines dramatically. So if you bet on, for example, on Monday night, Houston minus 22.5 versus Dallas instead of the typical 7.5 point spread, and for the record, I did that, it's actually quite enjoyable to watch your team get absolutely stomped. So the Cowboys are hopeless. I don't have a lot of optimism. I think they should tear the whole thing down. But I have been masking the pain this year by just betting against them and doing very well doing so. And my son and I, my oldest and I went to opening day and had occasion to cross paths with Jerry Jones, and he was very kind and spent time with us. And so it's made it much harder this year for me to criticize him, although much of this mess clearly rests at his feet because they do need a real GM who's a professional and a football guy as compared to just the owner. But until that happens, I suspect the Cowboys will continue to frustrate me.
No, thank you very, very much. It does seem like they're struggling. Again, David, it's a pleasure to talk to you about a broad range of subjects. I mean, whether it's the FTC and antitrust investigations, or it's one of our favorite topics and we digress, the Chicago Bears and sports and the Cowboys and those kinds of things. it does feel like we've had a turnover in administrations, or we're having a turnover in administrations. It does seem like just like we've had a turnover from Joe Biden, who is a fine man, a little bit out to lunch more recently. It seems like time for a turnover of the McCaskey family and the Jerry Jones dynasty. If you had to choose one person to hang with, Jerry Jones or Jimmy Johnson, who is it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think probably still Jerry Jones, just because the amount of time he's had with the franchise. I think I have more questions, good and bad, that I want to ask him. But Jimmy Johnson certainly deserves quite a darn bit of credit for the Cowboys mini dynasty in the early '90s that I enjoyed so much, and I would certainly enjoy visiting with him as well.
Thank you very much, David. Always a great pleasure to visit with you. One of the smartest people I get to talk to. I hope our audience enjoys it. I know we come off the topic of private equity and business for a while in talking to David, but I enjoy it tremendously. I hope you learned something. I learned something. I'm always a little devastated by what he says about our Chicago Bears, but love his thoughts on everything else. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.